Hello, mathematicians. Today we're going to be learning about division using decimals. And in this video, we're going to be focusing on decimals divided by whole numbers. To get us started, we have 7 2/10 divided by 3. And now 7 2/10 is our dividend, so when we write out long division, that's the number that goes on the inside. Then 3 is our divisor, so that would be the number that goes on the outside. When we are dividing by a whole number, we divide normally, except once we get to our decimal point, we're just going to move it up. And I'll show you guys exactly what I mean by that in a little bit. So let's divide normally until we get to our decimal point. We're going to ask ourselves, how many times does 3 go into 7? Well, 3 goes into 7 2 times, and that's because 3 times 2 is equal to 6. So we're going to take the 7 and subtract it by 6. 7 minus 6 is equal to 1. Now, if we were dividing normally, we would typically bring down the 2 now, but because we're at our decimal point, we're going to bring that up. If we don't do this, the value of our final answer will be incorrect. Now we could go ahead and bring our 2 down. And then once we do that, we ask ourselves, how many times does 3 go into 12? And so that would be 4 times, and that's because 3 times 4 is equal to 12. Now we're going to take our 12 and then subtract it by 12. And so we get 0. So we have no remainder at all right now, and that tells us that 7 2/10 divided by 3 is equal to 2 4/10. Now let's do another example. Here we have 51 66/100 divided by 42. 51 66/100 is our dividend, so we write that number on the inside. And we're dividing by 42, so that would make 42 our divisor, and that number would go on the outside. All right, so let's start off by dividing normally. We're going to ask ourselves, how many times does 42 go into 5? Well, it doesn't. So then we ask ourselves, how many times does 42 go into 51? And 42 goes into 51 one whole time. And that's because 42 times 1 is equal to 42. And so we're going to do 51 minus 42. 51 minus 42 is equal to 9. Before we bring down the 6, we have a decimal point that we need to bring up. So do not forget to do that, or the value of our answer will be incorrect. After we do that, now we can bring the 6 down, and we have 96. So we ask ourselves, how many times could 42 go into 96? And that would be 2 times. And that's because 42 times 2 is equal to 84. Now, if we tried 42 times 3, that would be too big. So then we're going to take the 96 and subtract it by 84. And 96 minus 84 is equal to 12. Then we bring down the next 6. And then we ask ourselves, how many times does 42 go into 126? And that would be 3 times. And that's because 42 times 3 is equal to 126. And so we take 126 and subtract it by 126. And we have no remainder. So 51 66/100 divided by 42 is equal to 1 23/100. So let's do another example. Here we have 3 5/10 divided by 3. And 3 5/10 is our dividend. So when we write out long division, that would go on the inside. And divided by 3, 3 is our divisor, so that would go on the outside. And then we divide normally. So how many times does 3 go into 3? And that would be 1 time, because 3 times 1 is equal to 3. We're going to take our 3 and subtract it by 3, and we get 0. Now, notice that we have our decimal point next, so we bring that up. All right, don't forget to do that, or the value of our answer will be incorrect. Then we bring down the 5, and we ask ourselves, how many times does 3 go into 5? Well, 3 goes into 5 1 time, and that's because 3 times 1 is equal to 3. And then we take the 5 and subtract by 3. 5 minus 3 is 2. So notice here that we have a remainder. So at the very end, we're going to add a 0 and just keep going a little bit and see what happens. So then we ask ourselves, how many times does 3 go into 20? And that would be 6 times, because 3 times 6 is equal to 18. And so we do 20 minus 18. And notice again that we get another 2. So let's add another 0 and see what happens. So here we get 20. So we know that 3 goes into 20 6 times. And that's because 3 times 6 is equal to 18. And then we subtract again. And we get another 2. So if you notice here, our decimal is going to keep going. There are 2 ways we could approach writing our answer. The first way is writing it as 1.16 with this line on top of the 6 showing that the 6 will keep repeating over and over again. Or, depending on our answer, we might have to estimate and say it's about 1 and 1700ths. So it really depends what our problem is. So finally, we have 1 and 3200ths divided by 55. And 1 and 3200ths is our dividend, so that would go on the inside. And then 55 is our divisor, so that would go on the outside. Then we ask ourselves, how many times does 55 go into 1? Well, it doesn't. So notice that after the 1, we have a decimal point. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring that up and add a 0 before that, because our answer is going to be a decimal with a leading 0. And then we move on and ask ourselves, how many times does 55 go into 13? Well, it doesn't. And since we already have our decimal point, the next number would then be 0. And then we ask ourselves, how many times does 55 go into 132? And well, that would be 2 times, and that's because 55 times 2 is 110. So we write 110 underneath and then subtract. 132 minus 110 would equal 22. And notice here that we have a remainder, so we're going to add a 0 here and see what happens. So then we ask ourselves, how many times does 55 go into 220? And that would be 4 times. And that's because 55 times 4 is equal to 220. So then we take 220 and subtract it by 220. And we get 0. There's no remainder. So we know that 1 and 3200ths divided by 55 is equal to 24 thousandths. And that's it for decimals divided by whole numbers.